topic is trauma-informed. So these are the areas that we're going to be covering. So what is trauma-informed? What trauma have our children experienced? What critical social and emotional skills do they need? Learners and educators. And then how do we identify learners and educators that need help? And how does the school community continue to instill good values in this changing world? So firstly, I want to start with what is trauma-informed? So the first thing I always need to state is that it's not a curriculum. Trauma-informed is a mind shift. So it's about viewing our children, our learners differently. And it's recognizing and understanding the impact that trauma has on our learners and on the way that they access learning. And this is how it applies to schools, because in order for us to help our learners, we first need to help ourselves and understand the fact that trauma impacts our brains. And unless we engage with that, we're going to struggle. So in order to access learning and rational thinking, we need our cortex to be engaged. So our brain is a triune brain, and there are 3 parts to it. We go into that in the training, we discuss the brain, and the fact that most of the children who come into our classrooms have experienced trauma, and with trauma, our cortex disengages. And then when it's disengaged, we're unable to learn or to reason or to be rational. And what happens is we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that's our survival mode. And you'll find that our children will do whatever it takes to keep themselves safe. So their behavior that they do very often is actually more around survival than it is around bad behavior. So we talk about switching from top-down teaching to bottom-up teaching. So helping children regulate their brains first so that their cortex can be engaged, and then they can actually access the learning that they're being taught. So let's see, what is trauma? So trauma is any event that changes our view of ourselves and the world. Trauma is how we perceive the event and not the actual event. So what is traumatic to one person is not necessarily traumatic to another. So some of the areas of abuse, of trauma, that were identified by the ACE study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done in America over 2 decades. They listed some of them, and I'm just going to run through them very briefly. So the first one is abuse, and obviously any kind of abuse, both emotional, sexual, physical, any kind of abuse is obviously a trauma. Domestic violence, witnessing or experiencing, community violence. So you can understand how many of our children experience this one alone, just living in communities where there's a lot of community violence, gang activity. And then illness, either long-term illness in a parent or a caregiver, or in themselves. Any major accident, a divorce is a traumatic experience for a child, death of a family member, substance abuse, living with a parent who is addicted to any kind of substance, and then a pandemic or a natural disaster of any kind, and bullying. So these were the main topics or areas that were identified through the ACE study of trauma. And many of our children prior to lockdown have experienced these traumas. And then suddenly this lockdown happened, the pandemic happened, and the traumas that many of them experienced were actually made worse. Because what's happened is they're now at home with the abuser or with the person that is creating the trauma, or they're living in their home and they're surrounded constantly by the violence in the gangs. And we know that so much of it has increased in this time. And even if they weren't exposed to any kind of trauma prior to this pandemic, this has created stress and anxiety in our children. And if you add it to previous children, to previous trauma, you can understand why our children come to school in fight, flight, or freeze mode. But what we've done is we've told our children to stay at home. When the lockdown happened, children were all told, you're not allowed to go out, you're not allowed to go to school, it's not safe, you've got to stay at home. And we created all this anxiety around it. And now suddenly we're saying, okay, you've got to go to school, but you're not allowed to connect with your friends, and you've got to keep yourself safe all the time. And that's a huge load for children to take on board. So the greatest skill that we can teach children is to self-regulate. If they never learn another skill, learning to self-regulate themselves is one of the greatest skills that we can teach them. So how can we do this? Because we cannot self-regulate if we haven't had somebody who co-regulates with us. So many children growing up in homes have not had parents who have known how to co-regulate with them. Possibly because they were never co-regulated. Children who are left to cry, left to scream, there's no attachment. All these things impact our self-regulation. So we now have children who come to school who are not very sure how to calm themselves with the anxiety that they're feeling, and so therefore they act out. And often our children with the worst behavior in school are the ones who need the greatest help. They're the ones who need to help and to be taught how to self-regulate. But we can't do this unless our teachers learn how to regulate themselves first. Often what happens is a child comes to school, something happens, and they disengage, they go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and then their behavior escalates because they're going into survival mode, and so they're behaving in a way that they feel will keep themselves safe. And it will either be to flight, okay, to run, so the one who runs out the classroom, who runs away, or fight, so the aggressive child, or the freeze, the child that just shrinks into themselves, puts their head down on the desk, gazes out the window, totally disengages. And that's what they've learned that will keep them safe. So then what often happens is that actually triggers the educator into their own fight or flight. So we need, as educators, they need to learn to self-regulate first. So part of our training and the trauma-informed schools, and I'm going to go into it in more detail, but it just shows how we can do that. And a lot of the first session is all about self-care for educators, because we recognize that as our children are experiencing anxiety, so too are the teachers. And so we need to give them and offer them just the help to be able to self-regulate. So we provide, so ways for self-regulation is providing opportunities to share and process their emotions, as well as structures that allow them to take individual time to reflect. This is for educators. They need opportunities to share and process what they're going through, the experience that we're going through. Hope House has been doing a lot of debriefing in schools for teachers, for educators, just helping them to have that space that is safe to share. And then providing for staff check-ins. So, just giving them the opportunity to recognize and understand and regulate their own emotions. So again, a safe space. And once teachers or adults in general who can do this are less likely to burn out. So if I can recognize when I am stressed, when I am under stress, I'm less likely to burn out if I take and do steps that will help me regulate myself and will help me take some self-care, whatever the way that I find best for myself. And then staff connection and support is absolutely vital. It's as vital for the teachers and educators as it is for the children. So we need to spend time putting into our educators, into our teachers, because our learners are only as healthy as our teachers. If our teachers are struggling, if our teachers are stressed, are burning out, that's going to connect to the learners, and we're going to have an increase in the bad behavior. And part of the training that we do is we look at actually many of the behaviors that our children are doing are actually not bad behaviors, they're trauma symptoms. So what can we do for regulation for learners? Provide opportunities and a safe space for them to talk about their fears and anxieties. So many of them are not going to talk about that in a classroom setting. We need to provide a safe space for them to be able to do that, to talk about how they're feeling, what they're fearing, what their anxieties are. And one of the ways we can do is also to create morning meetings. Morning meetings are becoming quite popular in quite a few schools, where they check in with each other, and as a teacher you check in with them, and you raise topics, discussion time. So it takes about 5 minutes, the beginning of the week or the beginning of the day, depending on the school and what they choose to do. But it's with questions like, how are you doing today? What emotions are you experiencing right now? What can you do to make the day better? What can you do to make this a good day? One of the things that, and these are just a few ideas, but one of the things that we do say, if you have morning meetings, you never ask them, what did you do over the weekend? What did you do over lockdown? Or what did you do over the holidays? Because that can be a trigger to traumatized children, especially those who are living in abusive situations or with abusive family members, or where home is a stressful place. So one of the things with Trauma Informed is that we try to create a safe space for them to regulate. And I will go into it more detail, but you'll see on the corner of my slide is something we call a calm zone. And in our training, we encourage the classes to put this space so that children are not sent out of the classroom, but they're given the opportunity to self-regulate. And I'll go into more detail in that in a minute. Establishing predictability, preparing the children for transitions or changes. So one of the big things, one of the big trauma triggers for children is unexpected behaviors or unexpected things. Trauma, unfortunately, doesn't give warning. So trauma doesn't say, okay, now you're going to experience trauma, or now you're going to be abused, or it just happens suddenly. And so anything that is sudden or anything that is unexpected can be a trigger for a child who has experienced trauma and abuse. We encourage building a connection, a relationship, and we show teachers how to do that without it being a long, drawn-out process. Simple things that are done throughout a day that actually develop a relationship with each learner. And it's simple things like using their name. And then stay regulated and help them become aware of their emotions. So we encourage teachers to stay regulated. Don't punish behaviors that are trauma symptoms. And don't yell or shout, because this can trigger a learner. Many of our learners who experience abuse are yelling and shouting often happens before the abuse happens. And so a child that is experiencing abuse at home or in communities, we know that with our community violence, a lot of it is involving shouting and screaming that goes on outside, domestic violence, all those things. And that triggers a child into a fight, flight, and freeze state, and their brain will disengage and they will be unable to access the learning. I'm going to now show a video which just talks about our program and what it is. And yeah, I will talk to it more in a minute.
violence in our schools is reaching a critical level as corroborated by the most recent study from the Center for Justice and Crime Prevention. In our Cape Town community, we know many schools that have had learners and teachers being shot or stabbed. Stressful curriculum expectations, overcrowded classrooms, the high incidence of substance use in the schools, and learners that are traumatized are all some factors leading to the precarious situation that the Western Cape schools face. Our children in our schools are exposed to trauma on a daily basis, via their families, communities, and peers. They are susceptible to abuse, violence, bullying, and more on a regular basis. Children whose brains are in pain cannot learn. Adverse childhood experiences studies showed that children who have experienced trauma are unable to calm their brains and therefore are in a constant state of hyperarousal and unable to engage their cortical brain, which is needed to learn. Unless we teach our teachers how to reframe student behavior, our youth are at risk of dropping out of school, turning to gangs, using substances, and eventually landing in prison. We can save our youth from slipping into the school expulsion to prison pipeline. Our youth deserve the best chance in life, despite or regardless of their home, community, or economic situation. Creating a trauma-informed, sensitive school environment gives our children the opportunity to regulate and to engage in the academic side of school. When teachers take the perspective of a student, things really shift. Teachers can intentionally help the class pay attention to what it feels like to feel good, enjoy positive emotions together as a community. The Hope House program teaches the school personnel, admin staff, teachers, security guards, etc., how to work with children who have been exposed to trauma. We give the teachers the tools to help regulate and engage the children in the classroom, thereby helping them to increase attendance, academic scores, retention and school rates, and decrease violence, aggression, dropout rates, and school suspensions. The Hope House program outline is Teacher Self-Care. Session 1, Defining Trauma and its Impact on the Development of the Brain. Session 2, Understanding the impact of trauma on the brain and learning and helping staff to understand what trauma behavior looks like in the classroom. Sessions 3 and 4, Tools and techniques to use in the classroom to engage and regulate children and get them ready to learn.
So that's just an introduction really to the trauma-informed training. I'm going to run through now what we do. So firstly, we show educators the regulation skills and how to help learners regulate themselves. So what Dina did before we started, that little bit of a mindfulness exercise, is something that we teach the teachers how to do. We teach them different exercises that they can do that take the matter of a few seconds that can help engage the cortex part of the brain. So teacher self-care is absolutely essential at this time. We really spend quite a lot of time around self-care, giving ideas, giving tips, giving reasons why self-care is so important. How can you slot self-care into your normal day, which is hectic? So we spend quite a bit of time around self-care. And then we give practical tools to help them shift to the trauma-informed mindset. We give them the knowledge as to how to do it without impacting the curriculum that they're teaching, because we recognize you don't want to take away from the teaching. You don't want to take away from the curriculum that has to be taught. But if the children are not engaging and learning, then it's a bit of a waste because they're not taking it in. And maybe not every child is learning, is in a fight and freeze mode at the same time. But we want all our children to be able to learn. And so being trauma-informed is not only for children who have experienced trauma, it's for all children. It benefits every single child in the classroom. So these are some of the self-regulatory tools that we give each teacher. I'm just going to run through. So we put fight, flight, and freeze into zones. So we discuss the zones and the behaviors that go with the zones, and then we give ideas. So what are the tools that work in each of the zones? We give the teachers a little booklet, which is a journal that we encourage them to create in the self-care section around themselves, and a journal for themselves. They get a book with all the tools, all the techniques, all mindfulness techniques, all the exercises that we go through in the training. They get a booklet with them in it. And then they get a toolbox with tools. We show them how to use these tools. We show them where to use them, when to use them. And we just create that space for each of the, and this goes into each of the classrooms. Sorry. Helping our teachers to understand the students and the impact that trauma has on their brain development creates a calmer classroom. And as a result of that, learners can access the teaching. Teachers have a greater sense of enjoyment of their teaching, less burnout. And one of the biggest benefits for the communities, for our country, for our children is that learners stay in school longer. So research has shown that children in a trauma-informed school stay in school longer, which cuts down on the school to prison pipeline. We have that because what happens is a child is suspended or expelled. Where do they go? They go to crime, they go to gangs, they go to drugs, and usually they end up in prison. And this is a well-known pipeline all over the world for children who are suspended or thrown out of school. And so the longer we can keep our children in school, the better. As Dina mentioned, our training is SACE accredited. They get 10 CPD points for attending the training. We won the award for it. So far, we've run the training in 13 schools, and they have all the schools that we've done it in so far that have been putting the trauma-informed practices into place have all reported a huge increase. Of course, then we hit lockdown, which has been a little bit challenging, but we do the training via Zoom, which has opened the training to all schools from different places. So we've done schools from up country, we've done schools in the rural areas. All this is able because of doing it via Zoom. And then we courier the tools and techniques to the schools. And that's my contact details if anybody's interested in contacting me around it. This is the certificate that we give. So it says this: in this school, we are trauma informed. We connect before we correct. We understand behavior is communication. We teach self-regulation and do co-regulation. We empathize when someone is flipping their lid. And that's a technique that we show them, that what happens to the brain. It's called, Dan Siegel calls it flipping their lid. We breathe deeply and love even more deeply. And we know that healing happens in relationships. And part of the training is we show teachers how to build that relationship with their students in very simple, very easy ways. My dream, if you like, and my goal would be to create our schools as safe zones, as buffers for our students to learn from the world that they live in, from the communities that they live in, just creating somewhere that for 3/4 almost of the day, they're safe. But at the moment, schools are not all safe spaces for children. And then lastly, before I give over to Natalie, remember everyone in the classroom has a story that leads to misbehavior or defiance. And 9 times out of 10, the story behind the misbehavior won't make you angry. it will break your heart. We have no idea what our children are experiencing at home, outside of the school.